Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest event in the Angler Event Series. My name is Jacqueline Burmeister, and I am part of the City of Worcester Department of Sustainability and Resilience Lakes and Ponds program. And a lot of what our department does is we are evaluating the water quality in the lakes and ponds in Worcester, working with the community to identify water quality challenges and work on community solutions to them to keep our waterways healthy and safe for recreation. So we're here tonight for the latest event, which is Worcester Area Wild Trout Fisheries. And we are hosting this event with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And we have a great guest here who's going to be doing the presentation for us this evening. This presentation is going to be recorded and available later. And at certain points during the presentation, we'll also have time for questions. So you will have that opportunity. You could either write them in the chat box or at the end, there'll be a chance for you to speak up as well. So just a little background on the 2021 Angler Event Series. This is a program of about 13 events that the local watershed associations in Worcester have put together. They got together one day and realized that across all of the water bodies, for all of the different challenges that they have and the uniqueness of all of those different waterways, one thing they had in common was the heavy use by anglers. There's some really great fishing in Worcester, and thought that this was a great opportunity to come together to put on a series of events to engage anglers in water quality issue, engage new people in the sport of angling, of fishing as well. So throughout 2021, we've hosted, I think at this point, 9 or 10 events all around topics related to fishing in Worcester, water quality issues, how it affects fishing, and they've been a lot of fun. A lot of them have been virtual. We've had some in-person events of things have been opening up, but a wide range of topics and for all people, anglers of all ages and experience levels. So if you are interested in this event, you enjoy it, I would encourage you to go back onto wooanglerseries.com and check out some of the other events that we have going on. So tonight's presentation is going to be brought to you by Adam Kautza, who works for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. He's the Coldwater Fisheries Project leader, and he's going to be talking to us about Worcester area wild trout fisheries, which are really special because wild trout require certain special conditions to thrive. And Worcester is really lucky in that we do have a few areas in the city that are home to wild trout. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those conditions and those areas in Worcester. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Adam.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right, so this actually is, of all the things that we do remotely, presentations are one of the few things that I haven't really been able to get used to. You know, I'm used to standing up there and like doing a lot of arm waving and interacting with the crowd, and it's just still a little weird to be able to just myself sitting alone and talking to a screen. But whatever, I'll do the best that I can with this. But so today, as Jacqueline said, I'm going to be talking about wild trout fisheries in and around the Worcester area. So I'll start by giving you an overview of distribution of wild trout resources in Massachusetts. I'll talk a bit about the conditions, you know, whether it's water quality, physical habitat, flow habitat, that are requirements for wild trout to survive and persist in a stream or river. And then I'll sort of finish up and talk more specifically about what sort of wild trout fishing opportunities you have right in the city of Worcester and then in sort of nearby areas. And again, I feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'm not sure exactly how that works with this presentation function here. I don't use WebEx that often, but you know, I'm happy to go with the flow and answer questions as we go along, or save them till the end. Whatever's easiest for you guys and Jacqueline, it's fine with me. So feel free. I guess just to
Yeah, if people write them in the chat, I could bring them up along the way so you don't have to keep an eye on that.
okay, yeah, whatever you guys like to do is fine with me. So I guess just a little bit more background about me so you kind of know what angle I'm taking with this presentation. So I'm the Coldwater Fisheries project leader for Mass Wildlife. And basically what that means is that anything cold water fisheries related, mainly anything wild trout related, I am involved with to some degree. Most of what I do is develop applied research projects to answer management questions for wild trout fisheries. I work on monitoring wild trout fisheries across the state, conservation projects, all sorts of different activities. But really, what I focus on is wild trout. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from, and it's going to be pretty heavily geared towards wild trout fisheries in streams and rivers. So let's go ahead and get started. So you'll see here a map of Massachusetts. Everything in red, everything highlighted in red is a stream or river that has evidence of natural reproduction of wild trout, whether that be brook trout, which is our only native trout to Massachusetts, or in some cases introduced brown trout, and in a very few cases introduced rainbow trout are found wild, naturally reproducing in certain streams in Massachusetts. So overall, we have 1,255 wild trout streams in the state. That number continues to increase as we find more and more, because we have not surveyed every stream. There's a few that we haven't gotten to yet, so we keep adding to this number each year. The vast majority of these wild trout streams are populated by wild brook trout. Again, our only native trout. 1,160 of the 1,255 have wild brook trout in them. A good number, slightly less than 200, have wild brown trout. Most cases, wild brown trout are sharing the habitat, at least some overlap with brook trout. There's not very many strictly wild brown trout streams in Massachusetts. There's a couple, but not very many. And there's even fewer wild rainbow trout streams. And those wild rainbows do share habitat with brook trout in all cases, but there's only 8 of them. They just don't do that well in New England waters in general. And I'll sort of touch on that when we talk about some of the habitat requirements and water quality requirements of wild trout. You'll also see that the distribution of these wild trout are very widespread. Basically every major watershed, other than I think 2, have at least one, or in some cases many more streams with wild trout. So we have wild brook trout down in Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod, in and around the Boston metro area. And then when we start getting to Worcester and west, there's wild trout all over the place. They're really, really widespread and quite abundant where we do find them. So, they're a resource that's not uncommon, but they certainly do, they're sensitive to in some regards, and do deserve, any additional protections that we are able to give them. Okay, so what are some habitat requirements for wild trout? So what sort of conditions do they need to be able to survive and reproduce in these streams and rivers? So we'll start, we can kind of break it out into 2 main components, one being water quality and the other being sort of physical habitat. And so I'll talk first about water quality. And, cold water fish are not called cold water for nothing. Really, the far and away the biggest component of wild trout habitat and all cold water fish habitat is temperature. Temperature is by far the most important component. If they have appropriate temperatures, they can deal with a lot of other things that may be problematic. When we talk about temperature with trout, brook trout, of the three main wild trout species we have, are the most sensitive to high temperatures. They can't really tolerate anything over about 68 degrees Fahrenheit for very long. So ideally, they want temperature in sort of the low 60s to high 50s, but they can tolerate up to 68, maybe 70 degrees if you have a high gradient stream, so there's more oxygen in the water. But anything above that for very long, and they usually die pretty quickly. Rainbow trout can also tolerate, just slightly higher temperatures, not much. They're in the same boat as brook trout. Brown trout, on the other hand, can tolerate slightly higher water temperatures. So brown trout can be fine at 68 degrees, even into the low 70s in some cases. And that's why we see brown trout in, a lot of places that brook trout just can't exist. They're still technically cold water, but they're a little bit warmer than brook trout can tolerate, and so we tend to see brown trout moving into those areas. So another component of water quality that we associate with a habitat requirement for wild trout is water clarity. So trout are visual predators, so they need to, actually see their prey to eat it. So clear water is really essential. I mean, they can deal with, dirty water to some extent, but if it's always muddy and always cloudy, they have a hard time, feeding effectively. So good water clarity is another important component. pH is something, we don't, as an agency, we don't measure a lot of water quality parameters. And I think Jacqueline's going to be talking about this in a little bit more detail towards the end. But we do measure things like temperature and pH, some of the really major parameters, and pH being one of them. Wild trout, particularly wild brook trout, are pretty adept at, tolerating low pH, especially. So brook trout, being native to New England, have dealt with low pH waters for millennium. So they've sort of been adapted to low pH that's typical of waters in the Northeast and New England. Brown trout and rainbow trout, on the other hand, are not from here. So brown trout are from Western Europe, generally the ones that were introduced here, and rainbow trout are from the Western US. Neither of those places have pH in general as low as we have typically here. So these fish just aren't adapted to having, acidic conditions. And so they tend to not do that well. That's why they're not as widespread as our native trout. So pH, is generally down to even 5 and 4, pretty acidic. Brook trout can tolerate. Anything below that, they are really, the adults are okay, but it's just they can't necessarily reproduce at extremely low pH. So moving on then and talking about kind of physical habitat and flow habitat. When we talk about flow habitat, we're talking about, the different components of a stream or river, whether it's cascades or riffles or pools or other sort of flow habitats. And I'll sort of walk through that here in a second. One of the main components of physical habitat when we talk about wild trout habitat requirements is sediment. So benthic sediment, trout can deal with, a wide range of sediment sizes. Generally, the more diversity in sediment sizes, the better. But really what they are unable to tolerate to any large degree is fine sediment. So silt, clay, really fine sand is problematic, not only for trout themselves, but also for their food resources, which are oftentimes benthic macroinvertebrates. But particularly trout themselves, the way they reproduce, they dig out what's called a red in the bottom sediments, on the the bottom of the stream. They dig out a shallow depression. lay the eggs are fertilized, and then they cover it back up. So the eggs are in this substrate, in this sediment throughout the winter and into the spring when they hatch out and swim away. So really they need anything from large coarse sand particles to very small cobbles, something that they can move around with their tail, but something with enough interstitial space that water can flow through and they can wash away metabolic waste materials and fine sediments and things like that. So when you run into issues with fine sediments settling into these interstitial spaces, smothering the eggs, smothering the newly hatched fry, that's when you get problems with fine sediment, and the fish just aren't able to successfully reproduce to the point where they have a self-sustaining population. So flow is another important component. Again, diversity is probably key for this. You want to have a variety of flow habitats. So you want to have riffles, which are generally shallow, rocky, faster water over a higher gradient. Generally these are areas that produce most of the food. So a lot of algae grows there, which is then consumed by benthic macroinvertebrates, which are then eaten by trout. There's the trout actively feed in these areas, and then contrast that with other flow habitats like pool habitat, which are lower gradient, slower, finer sediment settles out there. This is more, holding areas for trout that are in between feeding, or if there's a high flow event, they can go there and escape that. So you want to have a variety of flow habitats for different parts of the year and different conditions for trout to be able to have meet all of their life history requirements. And then structure, just sort of a catch-all term. When we think about structure being important, we think about large sediment like boulders and rocks that are current breaks that trout can hide behind and get out of current, and then sort of dart out to either side and pick off food that's floating by. Structure that provides overhead cover, whether it's undercut banks or overhanging vegetation that protects trout from aerial predators like ospreys and things like that. Large wood, down trees, things like that, which provide cover in from aquatic predators. Trout can hide in there. They can get out of the current. So other sort of aspects of that are important. So, all these things, water quality, particularly temperature, and then the physical and flow habitat, all these things are important to varying degrees for trout habitat. But again, temperature is the most important. If you have very cold water, the trout can deal with, lack of structure, or, slightly low pH, or, finer sediment spread over more of the river. If they have the temperature, they can sort of get away with some of the other things. If you have marginal temperatures, then lack of structure can really be an awful component. So it's sort of a balancing act there. Okay, so this is the area where I usually get accused of being negative. But it's really important to understand the issues that are affecting wild trout habitat and water quality. And if I sound like I'm being sort of a downer with this thing, with this topic, it's because it's so important. And I try not to be negative, but the fact is that there are a lot of very serious issues affecting wild trout, especially in places like Massachusetts, which is such a heavily developed state. And we'll go through each of these, item by item. But even if I sound negative, I just, I want you to realize that there are a lot of things you can also do, even though I'm not going to be talking about the things you can do to sort of remedy some of these issues. Know that they're out there. And so if you're interested in this kind of thing, reach out to your local watershed organization, reach out to other nonprofits, non-governmental organizations like Trout Unlimited, um, Native Fish Coalition, other sorts of organizations. There's a whole bunch of them, and see what you can do, how you can become involved with this, because Mass Wildlife as an agency, we're equipped to do certain things, but we're not equipped to solve all of these problems. And a lot of this work actually gets done on the grassroots level. So gets done by individual citizens like yourselves, you know, being involved with groups like watershed organizations and Trout Unlimited and things like that. So even though just this is a long preamble to this, but even though I sound like I'm being very negative, I'm just trying to relay the seriousness, but realize that there are things you can do to help with this. So so one of the biggest issues we see is dams and their associated impoundments, and we can sort of lump in there poorly designed road crossings, so perched culverts and things like that. So the big thing with dams is should be obvious, along with perched road crossings, is they're a barrier to movement. So fish, in the absence of any sort of dedicated working fish ladder, which most dams don't have, they're a complete barrier to movement. So fish can't get up, and fish generally aren't going to go down. And if they do, they can't get back up. So, there could be a population of trout above the dam and a population of trout below the dam, but they're not mixing together. There could be great habitat for those fish below the dam, above the dam, but they can't get there. So that's one of the big things with dams, which should be pretty obvious just thinking about what a dam does. The other thing is that dams impound water behind them, to varying degrees, how big that impoundment is. But it's always going to be exposed to the sun, and it's always going to have, you know, much warmer water temperatures than a free flowing stream. So right there, that impoundment no longer is habitat for cold water fish, at least for most of the year. Um, and then, as that water inevitably spills over the top of the dam and releases cold or warm water from that impoundment downstream, it creates issues for cold water habitat downstream as well. So when that dam is in place, it's affecting the trout and other cold water species both upstream and downstream, in addition to being a barrier to movement. So really a problem in cold water systems. Water withdrawals is another important issue that's affecting wild trout habitat and water quality. And this is something that hits pretty close to home for those of you in Worcester. Just across the line in Shrewsbury, I'm not going to blame anyone for this, but just across the line in Shrewsbury, there's a series of wells in the floodplain of one of your cold water fisheries, Poor Farm Brook. And oftentimes, because of water withdrawals in that area, that whole lower section is completely dry. There's no water in the channel. So, that's a huge problem. That's a pretty dramatic issue when we think about it. But even if the water withdrawals aren't enough to completely de-water the stream, there's issues with water withdrawals, because the stream channel where it intersects the water table is where we get infiltration of this cold groundwater into the stream channel itself. And so this is what buffers temperature. This is what creates cold water habitat in a lot of cases. When you drop that water table to the point where the stream channel no longer intersects it, you have issues with dewatering, but you also have issues with, there may still be water in the stream, but it's made up of mostly warmer surface water runoff. So you change this ratio of surface water runoff to groundwater infiltration, and you have just a warmer system in general. So water withdrawals, even if they're not as dramatic as I was telling you about with Poor Farm Brook, can be a big issue. And then speaking of, sort of surface water runoff, Another really big component, especially in developed landscapes, is stormwater runoff. So, think about a completely undeveloped watershed. A cold water fishery is, running through this watershed. A big rain event happens. That rain is being intercepted by trees, by ground vegetation. It's being, slowly percolated into the groundwater, which is then recharging the stream with cold groundwater over time. There's very little surface runoff. There is some, but not a lot. If you contrast that then with, a place like, Worcester, which is highly developed, a lot of pavement, roads, parking lots, even non-paved areas, which are, like roofs on buildings, highly manicured lawns and turf grass. When water comes down, there's no trees or very few trees to intercept that. It hits this impervious layer of ground and just gets funneled directly to storm drains, which then are funneled directly into stream channels. So this is a very different situation. The stream rises rapidly, it goes barreling through, and then falls back down shortly after that. So this is what's called a flashy hydrograph. Comes up fast and goes down fast. Much different than we would see in a more of a natural setting. And this has, two sort of big problems associated with it. One is that, a flashy system is problematic for fish living in it. They can get washed downstream. They can get buffeted with rocks and other sorts of things during these high flow events. But you also get a lot of stuff washed in, sediment, which is the biggest problem. You also get rampant bank erosion and other issues. When we talk about cold water, the big thing about stormwater runoff, when does this usually happen? So this is usually around, severe summer thunderstorms. And what is this blacktop during the summer? It's hot, right? When rain is falling on that, it also gets heated to a pretty big degree, and then it gets directly pushed into the stream channel through these stormwater drains. And so you have basically warm water getting flushed into these streams, and this is a huge problem for trout. If they can't escape this superheated water, they're done for. Even if the storm lasts 20 minutes, and it goes in there and it can wipe out a whole trout population or most of a trout population in a very short amount of time. Even if there's one thunderstorm on one day all summer long, that's why it's such an issue. So there's a lot of things being done to remedy that. There's different stormwater best management practices that they've installed on new developments. Swales and retention ponds and other sorts of things like that, which have done somewhat to remedy that. But there's also a lot of kind of old style stormwater drain systems that are still a problem. And then riparian loss is another major issue. Again, some of this is historic. There's not as much of that going on nowadays. Unfortunately, because there was less regulation in the past, we have a massive amount of riparian loss in urban areas, especially like Worcester and Boston and places like that. There's very little riparian buffer along a lot of these streams. And when you lose the riparian buffer, the vegetation, you lose shading, which is a major component of keeping water in these streams cool. You lose this buffering capability that stops some of the rain from or some of the surface water from being run off in like sheet flow off of lawns and streets and things like that. Can get intercepted by riparian vegetation. If you don't have that, you don't get that benefit. And then there's other components that sort of can go on and on and on, the benefits of the riparian vegetation. And then another issue, really is erosion and sedimentation. And I've sort of touched on this a bit. Sediment is a really big component of wild trout habitat. So we don't like to see, fine sediment in streams, but we do find a lot of fine sediment in sort of urban systems because, a lot of sand is put on, ice and snow in the winter, and this piles up and gets washed off during snowmelt or during rain events. It gets washed through stormwater drains into stream channels. And so we see a large amount of sediment in streams, which again is problematic for trout, not only their food source, but their reproduction. We also see increased sediment because of this issue with flashy hydrographs, where the water comes up and it erodes the banks. The banks are, obviously, that's made of soil and sediment, gets washed into the stream. Eventually, that settles out and introduces more sediment. So these are some of the major issues. Again, it sounds dire, and to be honest, in a lot of cases, it's a big problem, but trout are pretty hardy. They can deal with a lot as long as they have, good water temperature. And, there's a lot of work being done to remedy some of these issues. And chipping away bit by bit, we'll be able to improve the conditions for trout as we go along. And there's a lot that you can do. And reach out to some local organizations. If you want more ideas, feel free to contact me. I'll have my contact information sort of at the end. But it's probably too much to get into detail with this presentation. But if you're interested, get a hold of me or get a hold of somebody that that might be involved with this sort of thing. So that's a good path to go on. All right, so this is sort of a transition right now. Does anybody have any questions to this point? Not hearing any. Okay. So
we have one question in the chat, but I
oh,
think it would be a good one to save until the end.
okay. All right. Then yeah, I'll just wait till the end on that one. All right. So if there's no questions, then I'm going to move on. We'll sort of transition into talking about some of the angling opportunities in and around Worcester as far as wild trout go. All right. So here's the same map that I showed earlier, but superimposed on here in yellow is the city of Worcester. And you'll see that if you drive in any direction, except sort of east, you've got, a wealth of wild trout fisheries to sample. So way too many to ever go through in a lifetime. If you're interested in, sticking closer, even in the city limits of Worcester, there's a series of cold water fisheries. They're not all sort of created equal, and I'll talk about each of them in a little bit of detail here. But two of the sort of lower abundance, kind of on the lower end of the scale for quality of wild trout fishery, are in the western part of the city, Tatnuck Brook, and then in sort of the northeastern part of the city is Poor Farm Brook. They both have wild brook trout in them. They just tend to not be in very high abundance. And I'll show you some of the parameters that we've measured at all of these brooks here on the next slide. But in general, Tatnuck Brook, even though it's not a highly developed watershed, you can see in this map here that it's interrupted by a series of warm water ponds. So that sort of cuts up the trout habitat and creates situations where you have warm water releases downstream of each of these ponds. And so you have a limited amount of trout habitat in Tatnuck Brook. Poor Farm Brook, in certain areas there is some decent abundance of brook trout, but again, the lower part of that brook goes completely dry for most of the summer, almost every year. And then there's also a impassable dam sort of in that same area that kind of limits movement of trout. So those are two, although they do have wild trout, are sort of in the lower end of the scale when we think of, quote unquote quality of wild trout fishing. Coal Mine Brook and an unnamed tributary to Coal Mine Brook, are surprisingly, they have low to moderate abundances of brown trout. So brown trout are not all that common in this part of the state. Most of the wild brown trout we encounter are kind of further west, from the Connecticut River and west, particularly in sort of the Housatonic Basin and the Hoosic Basin. But for whatever reason, they're here, and they seem to be doing fairly well. And why that is, I'm not exactly sure. The unnamed tributary, especially, does maintain pretty cold water temperatures year round, and that's just that little offshoot you can see on Coal Mine Brook there, sort of in the middle eastern part of the city. And I'll touch on that when I show you some of the water quality parameters and habitat parameters that we measure on these streams. And then you have Ararat Brook, which is a complete anomaly. It starts out in Holden, flows generally south into Indian Lake, right in Worcester, and it's an exceptional wild brook trout stream. Has super high abundances of wild brook trout. It has really excellent size structure. So it has all size classes that you would expect present in a stream, including some really big fish. When we talk about wild brook trout, truly wild brook trout, other than certain situations like the Swift River or our sea run brook trout streams, which are a different story. The vast majority of wild brook trout, fully mature 3-year-old brook trout, which is about as old as they get, are 6-7 inches long. Not big, but in a small stream that's a big fish. But we easily find 8 and 9 inch fish in Ararat Brook pretty regularly. So for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, Ararat Brook is a really a great wild brook trout fishery. Okay, so just breaking these down a little bit more, the 5 brooks that you have in the Worcester, in the city limits of Worcester, and these are the parameters the basic parameters that we measure. So we collect fish data, we do a habitat assessment, which is just a rapid sort of visual assessment. It's pretty subjective, but it's what we use. A, a habitat assessment where we look at things like sediment, we look at structure and habitat and other components and add up the score, and then you get a total score out of 200. And then we do basic water quality like temperature, conductivity, which we don't necessarily use for very much, but we do take it. And then pH is the other one. And then we look at land use and land cover at sort of a watershed scale. And the 2 that I pulled out here are impervious cover, so the proportion of the watershed that's in impervious cover, most often that's blacktop, and then the amount of development. So whether that's residential development, industrial development, I've sort of grouped it all together. So looking at these 5 brooks in relation to all wild trout streams in Massachusetts. So all wild trout streams in Massachusetts, we see that on average, temperature for these is around 17.1 degrees Celsius, which is low 60s, high 50s. I can't remember exactly what the conversion is in Fahrenheit. And then pH is right around basic, or right around neutral, sorry, around 7. If we look at the water, these basic water quality parameters for the Worcester streams, temperature falls right in line. So, you've got some higher temperatures, some lower temperatures, but on average, they, are equivalent to what you would expect for a wild trout stream anywhere in the state. And the same with pH. So right there, it tells us that the temperatures are amenable for these trout to survive. Looking at habitat, it's a little bit different picture. So for habitat in general in all Massachusetts wild brook trout or wild trout streams, it's about 159 out of 200. The scores are quite a bit lower on average in these Worcester area streams. You know, a lot of that has to do with the issues that I was talking about before. So not a lot of, you know, habitat structure. So there's not a lot of wood cover or undercut banks or things like that, which would make them score higher for habitat, you know, physical habitat. And there's also issues with sediment, which drops the score a bit. So in general, you know, water quality, okay, habitat, not as great, you know, when we sort of compare them to trout streams in other parts of the state. And then here's the big one, where, you know, Worcester, you know, being an urban setting, really is much different. So in general, wild trout streams in Massachusetts drain watersheds that have very little impervious cover and very little development. So, you know, 2% impervious cover, 9% development. When we look highlighted here, the 5 brooks in Worcester, if we throw out Tatnuck Brook, which is, again, as I said, not a highly developed watershed, if we look at the others, impervious cover is massive. You know, Coal Mine Brook, almost half of its watershed is impervious, which is pretty crazy. And then development is super high too. 83% of Coal Mine Brook, the watershed, is in some sort of development. So the fact that these still hold trout, and even in some, you know, moderate abundances, is pretty unbelievable. But you know, for whatever reason, they're able to maintain water temperatures enough for them to hold on. So that's why, you know, that sort of goes back to what I said before. If you have the temperature, if you can maintain that temperature, you know, they can deal with a lot of other issues. So, you know, you have a temperature, you know, down below 20 degrees, you can have, you know, 40% impervious and 80% development. While not ideal, it still allows these fish to survive. Okay, so, you know, moving away from the actual city limits of Worcester, and like I said, any direction you can find good wild trout fishing. Everything in blue is a wild trout stream. So even if you go in like a 30-mile radius, you'll have more streams than you could probably realistically fish in 10 years. I've highlighted in red some of the ones that, you know, may be worth a closer look. These are all good wild trout streams, you know, but some are better than others. And again, this presentation is going to be available online. You know, I don't have the time to really go into these in minute detail for each and every one of them. But if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, or, you know, re-watch this presentation online and take a screenshot of this map. At some point, this sort of information is going to become more available. We've been working on different components of a wild trout management plan, and part of it is making, you know, this type of information more available to anglers. You know, different classifications of wild trout streams based on trout abundance and size structure and other things that might be of interest to anglers. So if you want to wait for that, you know, it'll come out and be available at some point as we move into the future. If you want to fish sooner than that, or if you want to see what these streams have to offer sooner than that, reach out to me or go explore them on your own. They're pretty easy to find. So, you know, this is just a breakdown of the same information that I showed you with the Worcester streams, just for the sort of dozen or so that I had highlighted in red. But again, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. You can come back and look at this on your own time if you'd like, or if you want to pick out a stream, you know, for example, like South Wachusett Brook, you know, which is a good one, and it's pretty big. You know, you can actually make real casts. Most of these, you know, a lot of the streams that we deal with are pretty small, hard to fish, still fishable, but, you know, it's not like you're going to be standing out in the middle of a river casting your fly rod. But, you know, for this example, South Wachusett Brook, you can do that. It's a pretty large large stream. So if you want to know more about that, reach out to me or go explore it, or, like I said, come back and rewatch this and look at this table. One thing that's important with these, none of these are stocked. None of the ones that I pulled out of this in this list are stocked with hatchery fish. They're all wild fish, mostly brook trout. Weeki Peaky Brook does have some brown trout, but they're pretty rare. It's mostly a wild brook trout game. But some of these have really, really high abundances. So when we look at statewide mean abundance for brook trout, it's about 362 brook trout per kilometer. A lot of these that I've pulled out, a lot of them very close to Worcester. Some of them like the Still River, Ararat Brook, Ball Brook, Warren Tannery Brook, all have well in excess of 1,000 brook trout per kilometer. It's a lot of fish. Um, they also have, in general, pretty good size structure. So when we think about sort of the presence of older age class fish, so these 3-year-old fish, which are, 6, 7, 8 inches, is really what people want to catch. Again, when you think about it, if you're not a small stream trout angler, you think 8 inches, not that exciting, but hook into an 8-inch fish in a 2-meter wide stream on a light fly rod, and it's a lot of fun, and they're really, really beautiful fish, and they're great settings. So it's something that you should really experience if you don't currently fish for these. It's really something that is a great resource for those of you who live in this area. All right, other opportunities. So if you're not super interested in fishing small streams, which I would encourage you to, it's an awesome experience. We have some other opportunities. So some larger streams in the area, 2 tributaries to the Wachusett Reservoir, so Quinnapoxet River and the Stillwater River, both just north of Worcester in West Boylston. I believe they're both in West Boylston. They might be on the border of a different town, but either way, they're very close. Quite a bit larger streams than most of the ones that I had mentioned, but they're also not as robust of wild trout fisheries. So Quinnapoxet has some wild trout. Mostly the wild trout that we see there are confined to the tributaries. There are some in the main stem during certain times of the year, but that also has both wild brook trout and wild brown trout, so that's an interesting component. But mostly what you're going to be dealing with here are stock trout if you're fishing the main stem. Stillwater River, same thing, but there's really no wild trout in the main stem Stillwater, except maybe certain times of the year some filter out from the tributaries, but generally it's going to be a stock trout fishery. What's interesting though about the Stillwater is that it has a unique opportunity for a fall run of landlocked Atlantic salmon, which you'll see a picture here in the corner. These are pretty big fish. They come out of Wachusett Reservoir to reproduce in the Stillwater River. So they're available to stream anglers during certain times of the year. So they reproduce in the river, then they go back out to the lake. They're young, grow up in the river, and then after a couple of years in the river, they also migrate out to the lake, get bigger, and then complete the cycle again. So it's a unique opportunity, and you can catch fish up to 22 plus inches in the stream. Another interesting development with the Quinnapoxet River. So I don't know if anybody's familiar, but there's a dam right at the mouth of the Quinnapoxet before it dumps into Wachusett Reservoir. That dam is in the process of, or going through the process of being removed. So it's going to be a couple of years yet, but it's very likely to be removed, which then potentially opens up all of the Quinnapoxet River and its tributaries to these landlocked Atlantic salmon. They're not necessarily going to go start rushing right in there immediately. Most of them spawn in the Stillwater, but at some point, some are going to start filtering in there, and they're going to establish spawning locations in the Quinnapoxet. At least, that's what we expect to happen. And then you'll have 2 opportunities in 2 very different river systems nearby to pursue these fish in the fall, which is really exciting from a fisheries perspective, and something that maybe you may be interested down the road. And again, these are wild fish, these landlocked Atlantic salmon. We don't stock these fish. We did initially years and years ago, but there's enough natural reproduction right now in the still water. And then if we add the quinnipoxates to that, it may be even more. There's enough natural reproduction to maintain a population of these fish in the lake and provide, this fall fishing opportunity in the tributary. So interesting. Okay, so that's all I have for now. Again, this is my contact information. If you're interested in any of this stuff, feel free to send me an email. My phone number's on there, but we're still not back in the office, so my phone number is probably not all that much help. So feel free to email me and reach out. And thanks for listening. And hopefully this was informative and interesting for you, and hopefully it sort of fit in with the bigger theme of the series of presentations, and hopefully it's something that you guys enjoyed. So thank you, and I'll take any questions you have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. That was really cool. We have a few questions in the chat already. And there is a request to go back to the slide with the list of brooks, please, just for a moment. And while you're, sorry, go on.
This one or the one of just the Worcester?
It was not specified.
Okay, I'll leave it at this one then.
That's that one. Okay. So there's another question here on Lake Quinsigamond. This is on, there was a necropsy done on certain fish species in Lake Quinsigamond regarding toxins in their systems. Can you touch on the results if you're aware of them, what toxins were found, if any, and if toxins were found embedded in the fish's makeup, what do you think contributed to this?
So unfortunately, I don't deal with any of that. So I can't really answer that, and I wouldn't want to speculate because I may be getting it completely wrong. But I would reach out if you're interested in that. I would reach out to an agency like Mass DEP, which may be involved with this. I'm not exactly sure, but they might be involved or be able to point you in a different direction. But yeah, at Mass Wildlife, we don't do anything with fish toxins or that sort of thing unless there's some sort of trigger for fish consumption. But we don't do any of the testing. If there's a fish consumption advisory, somebody will tell us and then we can put the word out. But we don't do any of the testing, and we don't really deal with fish toxins on that level. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question.
There is a question that actually echoed one of my questions about sand and salt. I noticed that you were measuring conductivity as part of your assessment, and we had a question about if Worcester could use a coarser sand for snow and ice control, if that would be effective at helping to reduce that fine sediment, I assume. And my question, I guess, had to do with the severity of salt compared to these other parameters on affecting the survival rate of these fish in urban environments.
Yeah, so the thing is, there's quite a bit to unpack with that question. So I guess we'll start with the sand. So yeah, I mean, it would be great if we didn't use any sand, because sand coming in is really quite a big problem, and people don't think about it because they throw it on the snow, it creates traction, and then it just sort of gets washed away over time, and you don't really think about it. But it's a huge problem in a lot of streams, particularly in sort of concentrate areas with a lot of roads and pavement and things like that. There are alternatives, but they're not. People don't like them. I think one of the big ones is you can use beet juice, which of all things, you can use beet juice as as a snow and ice melt. I don't know if it's straight beet juice or if it's mixed with something, but people don't want it because it stains things. It stains their car. It can stain their clothes. But that would be an alternative. You just, use that instead of salt and sand and things like that. I used to live out in Idaho, and they used ash, like ash from you wood, burnt wood. I don't know, what the ramifications of that might be. I'm sure it's not completely, benign, but there's alternatives to the sand. But the thing is that it's sort of established. That's what people do. That's what people know, and they don't want to deal with beet juice. But there are things to explore other than sand. And then as far as road salt goes, the thing is we measure conductivity when we do our survey, and we do our surveys in the summer, so we're sort of getting a very limited snapshot of what the conductivity is. You know, Snowmelt runoff, the conductivity is probably through the roof. What that does to the trout or the other fish, I'm not exactly sure. There is studies, and if you have access to some of the literature out there, there are, just off the top of my head, remembering some of the stuff I've read, you know, it it can limit the ability for them to reproduce, for fish to reproduce successfully. It can, sort of be problematic, especially for more sensitive species. So they tend to, in an assemblage of fish in a stream, you sort of see a reduced number of species. Some of the more sensitive ones to high conductivity and salt might just kind of disappear. They can also be a problem to some of their food sources. So the benthic macroinvertebrates, the more sensitive ones, some certain species of mayflies or stoneflies may be highly affected by, extreme instances of road salt. But again, I don't have that sort of information. We don't look at it specifically. That's sort of a question that is answered by other individuals. But it's certainly a problem. Both sand, which is obvious because you can see it, but also, there's a lot of literature out there on the issues surrounding salt. And was there a third part to that question? I can't remember.
I think, yeah, just how severe we think it is compared to the other threats, but it sounds like you did kind of answer that already
Okay.
as far as not really having the measurements.
Yeah, it's not good. I don't have the expertise to be able to say how bad it actually is. But certainly, you can find that information. It's generally available if you want to dive down that and look on Google. You can pick it up. It's not like a secret. It's certainly a problem. I don't have enough knowledge to say how big of a problem it is, but the sand is definitely obvious.
So there was a comment, a lot of towns have stopped using sand in road treatment in order to mitigate cleanouts of catch basins for the MS4. Um, yes, switching
Yeah.
to salt is helpful in reducing the amount which you need to clean your catch basins. Another question we had was, do we have evidence of wild trout die-off events from times in the last couple of summers when there have been drought periods?
So, anecdotally, yes, but the thing is, there may be a die off in part of a stream, and if you're not there to see it, within a couple of days or a week, you're not going to even know what happened. There may be a stream way back in the woods that went dry, the trout died, and if no one's there to see it, you can't really document it. But as we go back and resurvey some of these streams, we see that there's far less fish this time around than there was 5, 10 years ago. you can attribute that to a number of different things, but anecdotally, it could be the drought. But also, if the stream doesn't go completely dry, trout are pretty good. I mean, they deal with, it's not like drought is a new phenomenon. Drought has been happening, forever. And so these trout, they know, they know what to do. They can sort of move downstream, move upstream, and as long as they have, some water, uh, they can survive. It may be a subset of them can survive, but when that water comes back, they can redistribute. And especially with brook trout, their life history is adapted to sort of extreme conditions. So, you know, they generally are sexually mature at 1 year of age, and they really only live to be 3 years old. So, they can come back pretty quick. If you kill off a big proportion of the population, it's not like there's sturgeon that live 100 years and aren't mature until they're 40 years old. If you kill off even most of the population of brook trout in a small stream, the next year with a couple good years of water, it'll be right back to what it was before. The problem is when you have a stream that goes completely dry and there's no refugia. So there's no tributaries coming in. It may end at a stream that's too warm. So if it goes dry, there's nowhere for these fish to go. And then when it gets re-watered, there's nowhere for fish to come from to repopulate it. So that's when you get into the real problem in these isolated systems. And that's what you get sometimes in these urban areas where a lot of the surrounding streams have sort of are no longer cold water habitat. You have one isolated stream that's holding on the cold water. If that goes dry and the trout die, there's no source population to come and repopulate that. So, it's a long answer, but drought, it affects different systems differently. So it certainly can be a problem in some areas. And in other areas, it's just sort of a temporary blip.
We had a question regarding that Lake Quinsigamon and how it used to support smelt runs. If you haven't heard much about the smelt runs in the last few years, is there anything that we could be doing? The Fitzgerald Brook from the Quinsigamon up to Crow Hill and Ecotarium was the stretch that this person had heard about.
Yeah, so the thing, I don't know, I don't deal with smelt too much. There is sort of generally the inland populations of smelt are very cyclical. There's smelt in Quabbin Reservoir, for example, and occasionally you'll get a really good year class of smelt. They'll reproduce, they'll survive and be recruited to adulthood, and you'll have a bunch of smelt. And then for whatever reason, you won't see them for like 4 or 5 years. They'll be very low abundance, and then they'll be high abundance again. And so I'm not exactly sure what conditions they need, and I'm not sure if that's cyclical, if it's a sort of a regular cycle or if it's just haphazard. But we do see that in Quabbin Reservoir, which Quabbin doesn't have any of the issues that Quinsigamon does. The whole basin is undeveloped. It's pretty wild, and so I'm not sure how those sort of match up, but we do see kind of these ups and downs with smelt in other places that we have smelt. Part of that could be stream flows during the time that they're spawning. So they're early spring spawners. If they don't have the right flow conditions, they may not be triggered to spawn, or they may go up and spawn unsuccessfully. There's been some talk that pH, so sort of low, like extremely low pH during certain times of the spawning season can be a problem. But again, I don't know enough about it. We haven't done a lot of work with inland populations of smelt to the point where we can actually answer those, very specific questions. We kind of just know that they go up and down, but we don't have a a good beat on why that is just yet.
So we had one question that was put in the chat really early on that was very Worcester specific. What's happening with the Poor Farm Brook site adjacent to the former Allegro near Clark Street School? All the trees behind the brook have been cleared. And my understanding is that parcel is being redeveloped for a school bus depot, and that there's also going to be a large conservation restriction on it that's being managed by the Greater Worcester Land Trust. Do we have any other questions? Oh, Colin says there's more to come and that we're working with the water department for dam removal. So if there are no more questions, I just have a couple more slides for you to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Worcester watersheds to monitor and help to address some of the issues that Adam was talking about during the presentation. And thank you so much, Adam. That was excellent. That was some really great information, very specific to our local streams and ponds. So the Lakes and Ponds program does some additional monitoring here in Worcester at our 4 cold water fishery designated streams. So we have Tatnick Brook, Ararat Brook, Poor Farm Brook, and Coal Mine Brook, and we actually head out there about twice a month to do measurements of pH, dissolved oxygen, temperature, as well as some other parameters, including suspended solids and that sediment that those are all those factors that, you know, we want to just keep a close eye on to make sure that we're not seeing anything that's going to really contribute to the detriment of these waterways. We don't do as much habitat observations as we probably could, and that's definitely something that we'll be looking into in the future. But we take this information and we try to identify locations that we could improve the watershed and try to reduce the risk of some of these challenges and threats that these highly developed watersheds are posing on our trout fisheries. So just recently on Coal Mine Brook, for example, we have put in some green infrastructure right next to Lake Quinsigamond that is going to slow down some of the water that comes off the road on Lake Ave North and let it filter into the ground and filter in a lot of that sediment and nutrients that would otherwise go ripping right into Coal Mine Brook in that area. So we're trying to identify those locations and, as Adam said, bit by bit start building more green infrastructure into the system, and all based on this monitoring that we're doing. Additionally, at Lake Quinsigamond, which does support a few cold water species as well, it's actually stocked twice a year with rainbow trout. We do profiles for oxygen and temperature to kind of observe how the habitat in the lake itself is able to support some of these fish that have more sensitive tolerances to cold water and oxygen. So in addition to having to be cool enough, water needs to have enough oxygen to support these species. And throughout the water column in a lake, that can change throughout the year if the water is very deep. And so we monitor that, and we look at how those different factors are stressing the fish as well. And we've been doing that for some time now. So I guess that is really it. This is one of the last virtual events that we have in the Angler Event Series. We do have some more events coming up in the next few weeks. Currently, we are accepting Fish Tales, or Stories of Fishing in the Heart of the Commonwealth, which is an event where we are accepting stories about fishing in our Worcester waters through an online portal where you could win prizes for your fish tales there. You just share a photo or your story on a survey, and then eventually we will be sharing them with the public at an in-person event finally. So we have some cool events coming up like that, and a few other live events in August and September. You could find those at wooanglerseries.com. You could also find this event, the recording for it. It's going to be posted on wooanglerseries.com as well. So if you want to go back and check those lists again for those local cold water fisheries and the trout habitat, you can do that as well.